because of capitalism and because capitalism invokes individualism, we are completely out of practice of this understanding of how we're interconnected. And we're also encouraged to really see things that aren't associated with us as not our problem.
Welcome to the Kindness Is podcast, presented by Kind Cotton, where we take a deep dive into the true meaning of kindness. I'm your host, co-founder of Kind Cotton, Kaitlin Johnstone. Let's dive in.
Wake up.
Hey everyone, my guest today has given me immense hope in a time in which many of us are not feeling hopeful. Raeeka, she is a parent and a British-Iranian social and climate justice activist. They work for Parents for Future UK, which is a group focused on empowering caregivers into the climate movement. They are also on the Stop Rosebank team, working to stop new oil and gas in the North Sea. They believe all of our movements are interconnected and can support our collective liberation if we focus on building the connective tissue between them. Raeeka, I am so honored to be holding this space with you today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and we were chatting about this a little bit before we hopped on, I started following you a while back now on Instagram, which is how I get many of my guests on this podcast, because Instagram can be a very horrific space at sometimes, right? And it can also be this beautiful space in which people can connect and share ideas and share collective community care. And all of those things are exactly what your page and what you exemplify. And I want to know what inspired you to start writing and putting it out there on social media.
That's a great question. Thank you. I've actually always written since I was a kid. I think it's just been in my bones. But I wasn't really kind of directing it with any particular focus until around, I think, 2016. And then towards 2020, I really got honed on it. And I think a lot of us in 2020 had our individual moments of reckoning with, whether it's a racial reckoning or with what was happening with COVID and this concept of, oh, wow, we actually have to care for each other. Like, we actually have to do this. So I guess I'd been sort of honing the practice of writing, but I wasn't really sure what it was that I wanted to write about. And then, from around 2020, because of obviously the murder of George Floyd, COVID, which particularly hit me quite hard because my mother is immunocompromised. And we really started to see the world from a different lens, where people would sometimes care, but sometimes not care. And as a brown person living in the UK, I was basically wandering around acting like a white person or thinking that I was a white person. And I think quite a lot of brown folks can relate to that. And in 2020, the sort of piece around the racial reckoning really made me sit down and think, hang on, who am I and what am I pretending isn't happening around me? And how am I participating in upholding some of these systems of oppression that we're all operating under? So that's when I really just started to play a little bit more with my writing around social justice. It was always very kind of poetic and very kind of like, I'm Iranian, so we're romantics and we're poets. That was always going to be the case. But I guess the kind of marrying of what was happening in the world, the reality of both my individual privilege, but also where I didn't hold privilege, and really kind of exploring the intersections of my identity and realizing, oh, okay, this is where I can stand in solidarity with others. And this is where I need to call for solidarity from others, and starting to play with that in the writing.
And you do a beautiful job at that. You are still a romantic poet, and you do it in a way in which I can't even quite describe the way I feel when I read your writing. It's It's everything that I'm feeling. It's so relatable. It's so deep and moving, and it also really gets you thinking. So I think you're bringing all of those pieces of your identity, all of those pieces of what really inspires you and makes you passionate, and you're bringing it into your advocacy efforts, which I think, I mean, hats off to you because there are many times where I feel like I'm hopping on social media and I don't want to say yelling at people because I do think I have this balance of listening empathetically and speaking as eloquently as possible when I am feeling enraged inside. But I mean, you do it better than anyone I follow. So I I appreciate that. Truly, it's if you are not following, I usually do this at the end, but can you please tell everyone where to follow you because your writing has really sparked something inside of me.
Oh, thank you. That's so lovely to hear. Yes, I'm on Instagram, unfortunately or fortunately, and it's my full name. So Raeeka Yassaie, Raeekayassaie. I'm the only one. So
Yeah, yeah, and I'll put that in the show notes too. So there are a ton of things I want to chat with you about. First, since you mentioned it, I similarly, when the pandemic hit, and if you've listened to the podcast, everyone has heard my story a million times. So I'm looking more about your story. But my parents are both very high risk. I see my parents all of the time. We are a very close family unit. I also had a newborn and I lived in Florida, which was the center of like crazy town. This is not existing. I had to deal with a lot of, am I wrong here? Like, is it me? Am I the problem in this scenario? Obviously, after years of being in the pandemic and still being in a pandemic, I realized that I am not. But it was hard for me to see, as I'm sure it was you, and continue to see a lack of community care. And I'm hoping you can speak to that for a moment.
definitely, yeah. I went through a very similar experience where, people that I thought would know better were, willing to put other people who were significantly at risk at even more risk. And I think, though, it speaks to both yours and my privilege levels that this was perhaps a inflection point for us where we really went, hang on, why why is it that people aren't getting this? Because perhaps we haven't really been impacted in such a severe way by something that actually many people around the world in different ways are being impacted on a daily basis. So I think that's the piece that I really want to speak to in terms of tempering the rage. I mean, righteous rage is very welcome in my space. But I also think that we can turn it into something loving, and we can understand that when when we are the one that is disadvantaged, when we are the one lacking power and privilege, there are also other points and places in our lives where it's flipped, and we're the ones kind of disregarding somebody else's experience or somebody else's need. And while that is a natural consequence of positionality, and we can't help it, if we understand that concept, then I think that community care is really an ongoing practice of noticing that and thinking, oh, okay, where is it that I hold privilege that somebody else doesn't? Where is it that I'm taking an action that, I don't even think about, that negatively impacts somebody else? And certainly for me, COVID really opened up my lens to disability activism in general.
Mhm.
And it just wasn't something that I knew anything about before. So I think that, particularly on social media, where it's very easy to move into an outrage cycle because it's designed to keep us in outrage, right? That's what it's for the clicks and for capitalism. I think that it is an act of resistance to try to show up in a loving way. I would also have no issue with people showing up with rage, and I do as well.
Mhm.
But, I think it's that understanding of what is the system of oppression that we're under that is resulting in us disregarding each other's needs. And that system of oppression is capitalism. And everything that we do that isn't gentle and that isn't soft and that isn't loving upholds that system. So how can we transmute and transform that righteous rage into love?
That's so powerful. And it's something that I need to be reminded of on a daily basis. And I try to find that balance. Particularly, it's interesting, right? Because we talk about often how your advocacy should not stop on social media. And I champion that very, very much so in my own life. I mean, I think all of my friends and family are tired of hearing me talk about homophobia, or tired of hearing me talk about climate, or tired of hearing me talk about COVID and racism and all of these things, and collective liberation, right? But I also have recognized the people in my life whom I love deeply, who have been with me for many, many years, are the ones who really take the brunt of my rage, right? So I may be saying something on social media. I may be saying, let's listen empathetically. Let's try to engage in conversation. Let's remember to love one another first while also educating. But it's really hard for me to do that when it comes down to the people I love. And I think that that is an important message too, right? Like, not just shouting at each other on social media, because listen, we know that raising awareness and posting and sharing information are very crucial, especially right now, because many of us weren't awake again to the atrocities that we are all witnessing on a daily basis. But there is a difference of amplifying and screaming at one another. And I realize that I really need to work on that in my personal life, because there have been many times where I feel like my family and friends aren't hearing me because of the way in which I'm approaching them. So I really appreciate that. It's a beautiful reminder for myself. Something else that you are very, very actively involved in and has helped me become more actively involved is climate. And you often say that if you are a resourced person in any sort of way, you need to be involved in climate action. Why is that so important?
I think that we've been fed a lie that climate change is happening in the far off distance and won't impact us in our lifetimes. And if we live in the global north or the west or whatever you want to call it, that it's not going to touch us at all, and actually that it's other countries. And while our intersectional lens should actually awaken us to the solidarity of, oh, I do care about future generations, or I do care about the global south, unfortunately, that isn't always the case. So I think that a lot of people think that the climate crisis is something that isn't really going to impact them. But the reason that all of us have to care, one, is because we need to flex that muscle of intersectional solidarity. We need to build that connective tissue across our movements and really care about other people. The other reason is that it is coming for us. It's here now. So like, I'm looking out my window in the UK. We've had so much rain. We've had more rain than we should be having right now. There are floods. There are schools that have been closed. There are playgrounds that have been closed. The weather is warmer than it should be, which means the plants are confused and things are happening at the wrong time. That all sounds like not very much, but the reality of the situation is that climate change means that the planet is warming. And if the planet continues to warm on its current trajectory, we're going to see all sorts of awful things that are already happening in some places around the world, but we're going to see it everywhere. So we're going to see, total obliteration of crops. We're not going to be able to grow food. We're going to have, homes being flooded. I mean, even in the UK right now, I wouldn't be surprised if insurers start, people who insure homes start to stop including flooding on that, because why would they? Why would they cover that if it starts to become more and more extreme? We're going to see more droughts. We're going to see more wildfires. And there's going to be millions, if not billions, of climate refugees, because what we're doing by allowing this temperature to go up and up and up without stopping it is we're making an unlivable planet. And the main reason that we're doing that is we're heating up the planet through man-made things. And one of the main things for that is fossil fuels, right? So we have to divest from new fossil fuels. We have to transition to renewables. And we also have to look at other things like our food system. There's a number of different things that we have to do, but divesting from fossil fuels and really understanding that we are currently living beyond the means of the planet's resources in a significant way, and we have to really bring down our emissions in order for our planet to be livable, not just for our kids, but even for ourselves. We may get to being older people and really be experiencing the negative impacts of the climate crisis in the US, in the UK. It's happening right now. So, that's why people also need to care, as well as that flexing the muscle of intersectional solidarity for the people that it's happening to right now on the front lines all around the world.
Yeah, and I think, going back to COVID, it's almost as if it's not affecting you immediately. You have this blissful ignorance, right? And that's the thing that really gets to me, particularly as someone else who also kind of woke up to disability advocacy and awareness around COVID, is we're all only temporarily able-bodied, right? Like, I want you to really sit with that and hear that, because climate is going to affect these things too, right? It's going to affect our lungs. It's going to affect our water sources. It's going to negatively impact us if it is not already, right? My husband and I couldn't believe last summer when we had the impacts here of the Canadian wildfires. We're like, wait a second, nature was our sacred space, right? Like, we're masking indoors still. So nature was supposed to be where we socialized and we got outdoors mask free and we enjoyed a hike with our family. And then, we had these long stretches of either being indoors or masking outside. And it's really scary. And I think, why do you think it is that people don't recognize this?
I think that the human mind isn't, designed, built, however you want to put it, hasn't evolved to hold the scale of the disaster that we are currently facing. And I guess the scale of the opportunity, if we want to put it in a positive way as well. We are really supposed to congregate in small groups of around 150 people and know our group of people and operate within a much smaller subsystem. And I think because of capitalism and because capitalism invokes individualism, we are completely out of practice of this understanding of how we're interconnected. And we're also encouraged to really see things that aren't associated with us as not our problem. And another reason is it's not just us as individuals. This encouragement is coming from the ruling class. It's coming from the 1%, because it's the billionaires and some of the people running some of our governments. They have a vested interest in keeping us unaware of the fact that this is happening to us, because we will then continue to consume. We will continue to make them capital, and they can just go about their merry business, exploiting all of us. So I think, and we have to remember that, a lot of these fossil fuel companies, they knew decades ago, they knew in the 1970s, if not before, what was coming if they didn't divest from fossil fuels. And they had a fork in the road, and they could have decided to invest in a different way, or they could invest in marketing to make us think that everything was fine, and also to try to blame us. Like, the idea of a carbon footprint, an individual carbon footprint, doesn't come from us. It comes from the fossil fuel companies. They invented that idea so that we would go, oh, well, I'll just worry about my flying and my recycling. And that's just, it's not a thing. So we have to understand that we are being pushed towards individualism because it suits the ruling class. We are being pushed into consuming because it suits the ruling class. And we are literally like frogs in boiling water with the climate crisis because it suits the ruling class for us to not suddenly wake up and realize that if we don't do this together, we're done for. And we have to wake up and realize, like, because I don't want to be done for. Like, I'm in
No.
this for keeps, you know. And we can. This is an opportunity. This is an inflection point for us to realize, okay, the old way is literally dying. So let's be a part of building this new way together.
So what would you say to people to do right now? And are you hopeful in ways? Because, oftentimes having the conversations that I have, well, beautiful and amazing, and there are so many people doing incredible work, and it reminds me of community and it reminds me of solidarity and collective action. There have been a lot of people who I've talked to who've been like, "No, Kaitlin, like we're fucked." So I'm wondering if you are hopeful, are there things that you have seen where maybe there are some changes in the right direction? And if so, where? And what can people do to become deeply rooted in this movement?
So what I will say is that if we give up hope, they win. So like
Mm,
not having hope isn't an option. It's not really on the table. And for anyone who says, excuse my language, as you said, we're fucked, that's coming from a place of privilege, because the people on the front lines that are trying to stop their homes being flooded, that have been displaced because of the climate crisis, a lot of them are hoping like hell because that is the
mm,
only option they have. It's fine for us to sit back here and say, oh, we're fucked. But like,
mhm.
we have to understand that that really comes from a place of privilege. And yes, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I believe in active hope. So I think that we have to take action and we have to hope, and those things hand in hand are where we will, really be able to see the shifts. And it is happening. There are groups of climate activists all around the world that are winning.
Mm,
One of the groups that I am a spokesperson for, we're currently trying to stop the Rosebank oil field in the UK. But a couple of years ago, we halted Cambo, which was a huge oil field. And that was because of the pressure of activists. So, we're small, but we are mighty. And this
mhm.
kind of stuff is happening all around the world. So if you're sitting back and saying we're fucked, but you're not in a climate action group, I would ask why you feel you're able to say that. And I would really encourage people to try and find a climate group in their local area or nationally to join. There are lots of different ones. You can literally type climate group plus your location into your search engine, and you'll probably produce something. Um,
Mm,
and if there's not one local to you, join one nationally. But you can also do things, if there's not one local to you, you can try to build community around you that tries to live in a more sustainable way, and start to sort of build that community care that has a climate justice lens into it as well. So yes, I'm very hopeful, because also every fraction of a degree that we prevent the temperature going up, lives saved. Like,
yeah.
it's not binary, even just a fraction of a degree is hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of lives saved. So there is so much for us to save. And why don't we frame that through the lens of possibility rather than this is game over? It's absolutely not game over. We've got everything to fight for.
Thank you. I heard you say a word that reminded me of something else I wanted to chat with you about, and the word was binary, because I feel as though we are living very much in binary thinking. Up until recently, I feel like you would hear the term binary thinking and you would just think of it through a gender lens, at least for me, right? And how no, like things are more fluid. And now that I hear that word more and more and more, I realize that that can apply to anything. It can apply to my parenting. I've been trying to not think in the binary when it comes to my daughter. I've been trying to live this way when it comes to a host of different things. And I'm curious, being an Iranian woman at this point in time, how have you been embracing the non-binary way of thinking with everything that is happening in the Middle East?
Thank you for that question. So first of all, it's interesting you talked about non-binariness, because I actually sort of identify more as a non-binary femme than as a woman. So that's kind of more my gender identity. And then, so in the Middle East, I'm Iranian, and we hold a very specific positionality in that region, which is that, our 45 years ago, there was a revolution in Iran that was hijacked by an extremist group. And now that entire nation of 80 million plus people is effectively living, under terror, under a terrorist group. But that group can legitimize itself all the time. So they're constantly allowed to go and sit on UN committees and kind of normalize their behavior. And for reasons probably to do with profit and money and oil, the West continues to allow that to happen. But what that means is, because of that lens where the Islamic Republic, that I would say is terrorizing Iran, it has got its fingers all the way through the region, because one of the things that it does is it creates proxies in other countries. It either creates proxies in other countries to try to replicate what it's done in Iran and to bolster it, or it has this very specific ability of hijacking resistance groups in order to spread terror. And that's where the non-binary piece comes in for me, because with everything that's going on in the Middle East, obviously, and I will say this from the bottom of my heart, free Palestine. I very much want a ceasefire. I want to see all the hostages released. I want to see, the end of arms sales. But what I will say is that the Islamic Republic does manipulate situations and try to expand its own reach by manipulating some of these things that are going on right now, which is why I always say in my advocacy that we need to dismantle and defund the Islamic Republic, because they will look like they are in support of a free Palestine. But the reality of the situation is they're absolutely not. They're only interested in pushing their own radical ideology, which is terror. And it's, it's horrifying. But what it can look like to some people around the West is that it looks like they're a friend of Palestine. If you look at it from a kind of binary perspective, that's great, they're helping. And some of their proxy groups, like the Houthis, for example, it can look through a lens like these groups are actually helping. But when you understand who they're funded by and what the intention is, and also the wider repercussions of what that means. For example, the Houthis are, effectively oppressing Yemeni people. So it's really trying to avoid that desire to oversimplify something. Now, I'm very careful to say that with caution in this instance, because I know that there's a lot of thinking around. It's not complicated, and I agree. Genocide isn't complicated.
No, yeah, exactly.
we know what that is. So I'm not disputing that, but a wider understanding of the region and how you can inadvertently support a bad actor by sitting in the binary needs to be said, and also to understand that there are multiple bad actors, right? So this binary idea that there is one bad actor in the region doing bad things is just not true. There are multiple, and you have to be aware of all of them because they interplay with each other. And I think it's a positive thing in a way that the people on the left in our movements are very much wanting to be in support of resistance, and that's fantastic. Of course, they should be. But I think I want to call in a little bit of white supremacy on this one, because there's an assumption that it's not possible for people in the Middle East to do bad things. It's not possible for there to be bad actors. Like, we're just not capable of being that way. And that's not true. The Islamic Republic terrorizing Iran is a perfect example of, of that exact thing. And I think there's a tendency with white leftists to almost want to romanticize it and simplify it and flatten it. And, unfortunately, some of my work is to try to take away that binary and that flattening and say, yes, there are things that we say aren't complicated. Genocide isn't complicated, but let's understand the full region. Let's understand all the actors in play. And, that's when it gets messy, but that's where the work is.
It's interesting to me that you can say all of those things and people are still enraged. I mean, it shouldn't be, because I understand as a white woman, which I shared with you prior to hopping on, that I've been doing a tremendous amount of learning over the past 5 months, right? Regrettably so, but and I've been doing that, almost that stage of what many white women were doing in 2020, of listening and learning and reading and truly like diving into books and diving into text and not just like shouting without knowing, also amplifying, but not shouting without knowing certain things. And it's almost wild to me that you could be saying all of the things that you're saying, right? Like demanding a ceasefire, return of all hostages, really grounded in humanity and collective liberation, not only for the Palestinian people, but, you've been talking about Congo and Sudan and Haiti and just all of these places where you want oppressed people to be free. But then the moment you throw in the Islamic Republic, you do seem to gain a lot of backlash. So it's interesting to me that it can't be an and, because you want all of these other things to stop too. You want the US to stop funding, right? Sending military weapons over there. So it's I don't have much other to say than it's just an interesting reflection.
Yeah, and I think some of that is because of the space in which I have to do a lot of this work. So, this communication that I'm doing is to the general public, and the best place to do that is on social media with free reign. And social media, as we've already discussed, is like a beautiful cesspit.
Yeah.
So it's like amazing and it's horrific. And I think it does that flattening. It does so much of the flattening kind of naturally, just by way of the medium. And I think that we've been trained to, watch something for less than 2 minutes. I mean, I think even now the trends are that you have to do a reel for 7 seconds, otherwise nobody cares anymore. So we've been trained into a lack of attention, and we're being trained into the binary. So that means that I can have grid posts that are dotted all over my grid that say ceasefire now, all the stuff that everyone wants to hear. And then I can write one post about the Islamic Republic and its proxies and allude to the fact that resistance can sometimes be hijacked by terror. And then suddenly, I'm not in support of a free Palestine. And that's just because the medium lends itself to us digesting this information in these tiny little chunks. And I think that's where we've got a wider responsibility to understand again, what these systems are intending to do. I mean, they want us, as much as they are trying to suppress the actual activism, they do want us on there outraged. They do want us on there engaging, because it makes them dollars.
Yep.
So I think we have to be conscious of the fact that in the liberatory work that we're doing, because often it is actually, leftists that come and shout at me and tell me, why don't you support this? Is that all of our liberation has got to happen in parallel. So if you're willing to say, this is okay at the expense of the Iranian people, or this is okay at the expense of the Tibetan people, or this is it, it's not liberatory. Like liberation is messy, and we have to be able to hold the both and. It doesn't mean that we necessarily are going to get it 100% right. But, I think that we have to take back, we have to reclaim our humanity, because the systems around us and the people that are benefiting from it are relying on us to not have our humanity. They're relying on us to scroll through a genocide. And we cannot allow that to be who we are. We have to be better than that.
Yeah. It's so true. It's so true. It's like it's my daughter recently fell down the stairs, and it was the scariest thing that has ever happened in my life as a mother. Just anything personal, it was she hit her head really hard at the bottom of the stairs. She was confused afterward. So we spent the night in the ER, right? And I just kept thinking as my sweet girl was lying in a hospital bed, okay, right? Like she was getting cookies while she was being monitored to ensure that she wasn't going to start vomiting or having seizures or any of that stuff. I couldn't stop thinking about children across the world, excuse me, globally who aren't even receiving care, who aren't receiving food, how we have almost been conditioned to see this live stream and then just go about our day. And it's something every day that I hold space for, and I can't just go about my day, but it seems as though many people are being conditioned to do so, and that's really scary when it comes to our collective humanity. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to underline the fact that, collective care is an essential part of our humanity. We all have to, anyone who's resourced has got to be consistently organizing in some way as resistance to these systems, because otherwise, without that care, we are literally just these ugly systems. Like that's all we are. There's nothing left. And it can't be that way when we can be so beautiful to each other, when we can be so exquisite to each other. We have to keep practicing, we have to keep showing up. And what that means is, you're emptying the dishwasher and you're going about your daily life, and you're aware, you're cognizant of the fact that there are multiple genocides happening around the world, that there's a climate crisis happening, there's a poly crisis happening. And yes, you have to live your individual life, but what does that little life look like? Where are you consistently organizing? How are you showing up in a way that helps to make this very, very unwell world a bit more well?
I think that leads into my final question, which you may have already kind of defined, but what does true kindness look like to you?
So I think true kindness is naming the reality of where we are so that we stop this cognitive dissonance, because it's that cognitive dissonance that is unkind. We need to really feel the experience of where humanity is, that we're at this inflection point, that we're at this precipice, that we're at the edge of a cliff. And we need to feel the grief of our participation in that. And then we need to do the repair.
Thank you for all that you are doing. Everyone, please go follow Raeeka. You've been a light right now, so I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the Kindness Is podcast. If you love it and it's adding even a little bit of value to your life, we would love, love, love if you could subscribe, rate, and review so we can reach even more people and make this world a little bit more kind.